Moving on to joins and relates, they're very similar things. Let's just focus on calling them joins, really, where we take data from one table and combine it with data in another table, or create a new object from it. We can also do that as well. When we take information from one place, combine it using keys. Remember when we spoke about keys before, the key being a particular piece of information that is unique, or at least in the circumstances we're interested in unique, to identify one object as being equivalent with another object. So let's look here. As an example, we're going to do a one-to-one search here, or join. We take information from our vector layer here. This is some form of vector object, points, lines, polygons, don't know, but in our attribute table we have these ID numbers, and then we have this P code, whatever that is. It's some piece of information which we're going to call the key, and we have these identifiers here, whatever that is. So this is our geospatial data. These are the vector objects. And then there's some other table. This doesn't have to be spatial at all. This is just some data in a table, an Excel table, a CSV, something, whatever it is. But it also has a column. They don't have to be called the same thing, but it has a column where this key that we're interested in, whichever it is that we're going to use, also exists. So we can go here and look for that information. And when we do that, we say, oh, okay, A:237, yep, there we go, there's A:237. Well, that's associated in this table with Monday 1. Right, okay, so let's join it to our vector. So it goes over there and we've joined it. And we can do the same thing for each of these columns here. Look, that there, 656 is there, and then that goes up there. So we join all of this data together to make the joined vector layer. And initially in our join, in most cases, what happens is that the join exists as a function, as a step in the or something that's happened within that project. That when you look at the file themselves, the files behind this, they're not joined. They are separate entities, but the join is there in the project until you export the data, until you create a new vector layer from it and say, right, now I want a new one where this data has been joined, and we make it permanent, as it were. Otherwise, the join exists only in the project. To basically look at the many-to-one and one-to-many, it just depends on which direction you're going, really. We have, for example, a similar situation where we have a vector layer here, whatever these vectors are, and we can use this column called type, and we're saying, well, type 1, we can pick up the information from this attribute table here, where type 1 actually translates as cereal. Type 2, which we have down there, is the legume, and so on and so forth. So this is an attribute table where we're describing the data in this. This is quite good, efficient data storage. Here we only need to store integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth, rather than having to store long words every time. So if imagine this table is incredibly long, we've got thousands of objects, we would save a lot of space by just having their type coded as an integer, taking up a lot less space. And then when we need to find out what that means, we can go to this lookup table here and say, well, 1 means cereal. Rather than having to store cereal several times over. This takes up a lot more space in our database than this. So this is a typical use of that sort of function, this joining over to here. So we then end up with our vector layer where we know what these types actually mean. The other GIS thing that we can do that you don't get to do in a normal, the joins that we've looked at previously, they apply to any SQL database, doesn't matter. But in terms of GIS, we have this extra function, of course, because we have the spatial quality of our data, where we do a spatial join. So we have two tables here. Both of these are vector layers. This one is points, and these are these red dots here, and this table here represents objects that are polygons, these rectangles here. And we can see that there is no common key. There's no way of joining these together. We don't know what's what, which one. There's no commonality between them. But in the map, in the spatial domain, there is commonality. We can see that 1 is within 107, 2 is within 106, 3 is within 102, and 4 is within 103, and 5 is out there on its own. And so we can spatially join the data where we look at this spatial relationship and say 1 is within 107, so it inherits the data from 107. 2 is within 106, so it inherits the data from 106, and so on. And then we have this last row here. Depending on what we say to the computer, we can keep row number 5 and just say, well, it doesn't have any of this information. Or we can just get rid of number 5. Say in our spatially joined data, there is no number 5 because it didn't have any connection with any of these. But we can do both. We can keep all of the data points and just have an empty row there, or we can get rid of those that don't have any spatial commonality with our second layer. So that's the spatial join. And we're getting near to the end now. Just what formats do we have? So what do we recognize as being a vector? Well, I've spoken a lot about the shape file, which is actually being used less and less. It has dominated GIS for a long time. It is still pretty much a standard file format for exchanging data in the vector format. But we also have others, such as the GML, Geographic Markup Language, which is it's an XML, along with KML. The GPS exchange format, GPX, data from simple GPS devices, your handheld device. Not so much for advanced GPS, GNSS, geodetic quality surveys. They tend not to use this format. But for the simpler device, this is quite often what you will get. And it's also an XML type of data. And then we have this. This is actually not terribly common, though it should be more common. I find this to be a very nice format, especially when you yourself have been out in the field gathering data by hand. This actually will be very handy to be implemented more often. You can find it in QGIS, but not. I don't think it's accessible in ArcGIS and ArcMap. There are many other formats, like as it says here, GDAL, which is a standard library for working with vector formats. They list over 100, and now I think more than this. The last time I looked, it was nearly, but I think we've had a couple of new formats come in. I think they're now over 100. We have the different database formats as well now, more that can be included in this. The geo package, for example, although that's not strictly speaking only vector. So that's the different types we have. And then just to finish off, summarizing the good and the bad, we have the discrete data where we can store that efficiently. If you remember, the problem with raster was that we have to fill up every single cell over an area. We have to fill it all up, and if nothing's happening, we just have to say that nothing here, nothing here, nothing here. Whereas with the discrete data of a vector, these distinct objects, where something exists, where something happens, then we write some data. Otherwise, we don't say anything. It's either all within the boundary of a polygon or it's outside of any information. It doesn't matter. It's not relevant. We don't need to say this is this, this is this, this is over and over again. It's just done. So it's quite efficient for this kind of discrete data. And because we have distinct objects, we can represent topology, the connections between things, the relationships between different objects as well. So that's which is very difficult to do in raster. And we can also increase the data richness associated with any particular objects. We can add more and more attributes quite efficiently, whereas with a raster we would need to keep adding more and more raster layers, increasing the amount of data storage of nonsense, no information data needed. But with vectors we can just keep adding more and more information relatively efficiently. And a subtle point that may not have been made entirely clear so far, thinking back to the first slide, that we can represent coordinates with high precision in vector. If we think back to the raster, we define one location, the corner, And then from that, we implicitly define the location of all of the cells in a raster. Where the information exists within that cell, we don't know. It's within that square. Whereas with a vector, we have well-defined points that our vector is defined at a particular point, or lines combining points. So we can potentially represent high precision data. Now, don't forget, precision isn't the same thing as accuracy. So just because we have lots of decimals on the end of our coordinate doesn't necessarily mean that our position has been defined to that accuracy. We're just storing it with a high precision. It may be in completely the wrong location, entirely inaccurate, but very precise. So what doesn't it do well? Continuous data, obviously the inverse as it were, because we are explicitly defining each data point with its location and everything else. We're having to do that for every single point, so that we end up with an excess of data. The big advantage with the raster is this implicit location, so we're just storing the data, and we know it changes in a regular pattern. So that's kind of efficient. We do have the triangulated irregular network as a way around this. It has its own problems. It works pretty well in many circumstances, where we can interpolate between points. Requires a mathematical interpolation afterwards. So it's relatively efficient as long as we have linear transitions over that surface. Vector data has it's expensive computationally, because we have so much that is explicit. We need to examine that explicit data storage and say, yes, this is a thing that exists there, and yes, it exists there, and we don't have an implicit relationship between them. It can make analysis and storage quite expensive, depending on what sort of data we're looking at. So there are ups and downs in both formats, but these are the good and the bad of vector. And I think we can finish there.